I'm going to talk a little bit about reincarnation. And just to be clear, it isn't my purpose here to argue either for or against reincarnation in a literal sense. I'm talking about reincarnation here primarily as a kind of metaphor. Before I can explain this metaphorical understanding of reincarnation, I'm going to have to briefly talk about the popular conception and misconceptions about this ancient doctrine. A lot of people who are superficially attracted to Eastern philosophy or Western occultism or New Age teachings have a distorted picture of reincarnation and what it means in light of the ancient view. They think it means they get to come back as a beautiful butterfly after they die. They think of it almost like Christians think about heaven. They think it's a positive thing, but the ancients didn't see it that way. They saw the cycle of rebirth more like hell than heaven. They saw it as something to escape from. There's also sort of the romantic Hollywood notion of soulmates who come back to Earth again and again to fall in love over and over again. Again, this is in stark contrast to the ancient view. If you understand material existence to be a place of suffering, or a prison, or illusion to be escaped from, then you would see your desire for this so-called soulmate as something to be overcome, because it's keeping you enslaved and preventing you from attaining liberation. You would see it as the bait in a trap, or the worm on the end of a fishhook. Moving on, I want to point out an interesting observation. Reincarnation is virtually indistinguishable from the naturalistic view that when you die, you just die. And this line of thought gets us into the question of what is the self? I don't want to go too deep down that rabbit hole in this video, because that's a whole other video series in itself. For the sake of this discussion, it's important to be aware of the ancient view that humans have a body, soul, and spirit. Obviously, when we die, the body dies. There have been people in history who believed in physical resurrection, but people who believe in reincarnation typically accept that the body just dies. It's the spirit that survives the death of the body and reincarnates. What most people don't realize is that in this worldview, the spirit is not the same as the soul. Some believers in reincarnation believed that the soul perished along with the body. Others believed that the soul survived with the spirit. Still others believed that the soul could become attached to either the body or the spirit, and that the soul which remained attached to the body perished with the body, and that the soul which detached itself from the body could ascend with the spirit. I'll talk about the first one first. The view that the soul dies with the body is indistinguishable from the naturalistic view. And by the soul, we mean the part of you that you think of as you. It includes your personality, your likes and dislikes, your memories, your dreams and desires, your sense of being an individual self, and pretty much everything you think of as yourself. And if this dies, then you die, for all practical purposes, as far as most people would be concerned. This is precisely the aspect of death that people find so terrifying. So this concept of reincarnation really doesn't offer any sense of hope. I mean, let's just assume that you existed in a previous incarnation as another person, but you don't remember anything about your previous life. For all intents and purposes, that person is just gone, and a completely different person was born. All that remains is the spirit. To put spirit in terms that a naturalist can relate to, the spirit is basically the part of you that's universally human. It's the archetypal form of humanity that exists in all of us. You can think of it as the observer self. Again, this doesn't assume any dualistic belief. It just means that our lives are essentially a flow of experiences. All of these objects of experience are experienced by a subject, who is experiencing those experiences. None of those objects of experience are the subject, which is experiencing them. So even all of your memories, thoughts, and emotions are not you in this sense. By spirit, we mean something completely depersonalized. The spirit in you is completely indistinguishable from the spirit in every other person, or even in every other animal, some might say. So to say that the spirit, but not the soul, survives the death of the body is for all practical purposes identical to saying that after you die, other people will be born who are not you. Only that which is archetypally human continues to exist. One generation of humanity succeeds the previous generation, but for all practical purposes, the previous generation is gone. Before moving on to the other viewpoints, I want to mention a few of my thoughts about this view from a non-literal perspective. First, the question naturally arises, why should I care about the generations that come after me if I'm dead? I believe this is one of the questions that the doctrine of reincarnation was intended to answer. And I don't think it's necessary to have a literal belief in reincarnation for the answer to hold meaning, and I hope to demonstrate that. And I want to repeat that I do not personally have or promote literal belief in reincarnation. Let me give you a kind of analogy, though. When I was 7 years old, I was so different than I am now that for all intents and purposes, that person no longer exists, and a different person exists now. The same is true of my 14-year-old self, my 21-year-old self, and even my 28-year-old self. As I'm recording this video, I'm a few months away from my 35th birthday. When my future 42-year-old self clicks on this video, he may think to himself, wow, I can't believe what a different person I was back then. And why should I care about that 42-year-old future me? In a lot of ways, he will no longer be me. So why should I care about him? Why, for example, should I sacrifice my pleasure for his sake? Why should I work hard and save up money so that my future 70-year-old self can have a comfortable retirement? What right does he have to ask me to bridle my desire for pleasure and enjoyment for his benefit? Am I not equally justified in demanding that he sacrifice his desire to have a comfortable retirement for my sake, so that I can enjoy an unbridled hedonistic lifestyle and just live for today? Now apply all of these same basic questions on a larger scale. I know some people will object here. They'll say it's not the same. They'll say, yeah, but the future you is still you. People who are born after you die are not you. But in what sense is the future me still me? Maybe some people never go through any radical changes in their lives, but I think most people can relate to me when I say that who I am now is a completely different person from who I was in the past. My way of seeing the world is so radically different that I might as well be living in a different universe than that former me. My likes and dislikes have changed. My tastes have changed. Things that mattered to me intensely before are now virtually forgotten and seem completely unimportant to me, on the extremely rare occasion that I even think about them at all. I care no more about those things than I care about things that happened to someone who died before I was ever born. I'm going to ask you to reflect on whether this is true for you and your experience as well. Obviously, on a biological level, all of the cells in your body have died and been replaced by new cells. So the body of my 21-year-old self has died. I now exist in a new body. Every cell is different. So even in a literal sense, you could say that I now exist in a different body. And as I've pointed out, it's questionable to what degree it's the same I that exists in this body. But even if the self is somewhat of a difficult philosophical question and something of a mystery, I think we all have this sense of self. We have this direct sense that something of the person we were still persists within the person we are now, and that something essential of the person we are now will persist within the person we will become. The naturalistic and humanistic conception of reincarnation that I'm proposing only extends this further. It's the simple recognition that something about who we essentially are persists after our funerals and continues to exist in newly born bodies. If you're a materialist, don't get stuck in a literal mindset and completely miss what I'm saying here. And if you're a spiritualist, don't think that I'm taking anything away from you by pointing out that a powerful realization exists here independently of any supernatural beliefs that you might have. Now moving on to the view that the soul may survive the death of the body, which is, I think, the view of reincarnation that appeals to many people, because it seems to offer the hope of an afterlife or immortality for the soul. I'm not going to get into the arguments or evidence for or against it. Case studies related to past life regression or out-of-body or near-death experiences are interesting to a lot of people, and I have nothing against discussing those things with a healthy balance of open-mindedness and skepticism. But that's not the discussion I'm having now. My argument here is more pragmatic, and I feel like I need to offer another warning against literal-mindedness as I proceed in talking about this. The survival of our soul after the death of our body hinges on one thing: whether our soul is identified with the material or the spiritual. The fear of death lies in confusion and ignorance regarding the nature of the self. What is this thing we call I? We're really not sure if we're honest, and philosophers disagree. It's a difficult philosophical question, and it's inseparable from the question of whether or not I survive the death of my body. I've raised the additional question of whether this I even really survives during the life of the body, and whether we're really justified in saying it's the same body due to cellular regeneration. Despite this, I've pointed out that we pretty much feel that there's some essential self that persists throughout our lifetime, even despite the lack of any real scientific or philosophical basis or explanation for this belief. Let that sink in for a moment. Now, how can we accept that sense, but reject the sense that there's an even deeper essential self, which persists lifetime after lifetime? It might be impossible to prove it to someone who doesn't share that deeper sense of self, but it would be just as impossible to prove the existence of a self that persists over the course of a single lifetime or incarnation to someone who doesn't share that sense. And indeed, there are those who deny the existence of any self which persists across a lifetime. But even these people who deny the existence of the self can't deny their experience of being a self, which begs the question of how a self which supposedly doesn't exist can have an experience of existing. Some people claim that the self is a kind of illusion. So who is it who is experiencing the illusion? Now, it's logically possible that what the self perceives itself to be is somehow an illusion. But it's a logical impossibility that the existence of the self itself is an illusion. But the logical impossibility of its non-existence is entirely contingent on the directness of the experience of it. Without that, it would be an exercise in futility to attempt to convince anyone who lacked that direct experience of self-awareness. In the same way, it would be an exercise in futility to attempt to convince anyone who possessed the direct experience of self-awareness that the self which is experiencing itself is itself an illusion. And I'm going to go a step further here. What if there was someone who had a direct experience of a self which transcended the limited sense of self that the vast majority of people experience? What if, in the same way that a 34-year-old experiences himself as an uninterrupted continuation of the self which formerly identified as his 14-year-old self, this man had an experience of himself as an uninterrupted continuation of a transcendent self which formerly identified as a series of individuals who succeeded each other, one after the other, in a chain of birth, death, and rebirth. The existence of this transcendent self would be self-evident and undeniable to the transcendent self itself. To anyone who lacked the direct experience of being one with this transcendent consciousness, its existence would be unprovable. To anyone who possessed it, it would be undoubtable. But there would be no possibility for debate on either side. So the only meaningful question would be how the person who lacked this level of self-awareness might come to attain it. The only way for an individual to have knowledge of this higher self would be to be led into a direct experience of being that higher self. No evidence or logical argument could ever lead someone to that knowledge. Faith could never lead someone to that knowledge either. Even if someone met another person who had this knowledge, that person would not be able to impart their knowledge to them. It would be a truly hidden knowledge. Someone who had this knowledge could never convince you that they had this knowledge, or even that this knowledge existed. They could only offer you this 2-word challenge and then be silent. Know thyself. In closing, I just want to sum up what I think is the main takeaway here. In the same way that you care about the future you, and for essentially the same reasons, it makes sense to care about the future generations which will be born after you. If it makes sense to think of my future self, which in many ways will be a different person from my present self, as still being essentially me, then it isn't a complete stretch to think of someone else who will be born and live after I die as still being essentially me too. From there, it isn't a huge stretch to think of all people, or even all living beings, as sharing the same essential self as me, and to love others as myself. Adopting this attitude, even without adopting this as a literal belief, can lead you into an experience of identification with a transcendent self which is free from the fear of death, and out of which compassion naturally flows. I'm not trying to convince anyone to adopt a belief. I'm only recommending a practice that I believe will improve your life, and which may even lead you to a knowledge beyond belief.